Alrighty, let's get started in the third lecture of the fourth week. This one's going to be looking at psychological impact of fandom and looking primarily at four areas that are sort of critiques of sports fans. The first is that sports fans are lazy. The second, which has been a common topic in our course this semester, is that sports fans are aggressive. Third is that they have negative values and maladaptive behaviors due to fandom. And fourth is that they have poor interpersonal relationships outside of sports fans. And we can think of these four as either a causal relationship with sports fandom, so that the fandom actually creates increased laziness, more aggression, increased negative values, and worsens relationship, or it could be as these four items are sort of built into the individuals, and then they are drawn to sports because of perhaps some of these characteristics. We tend to look at it as sports are causing these or perhaps exacerbating these, but you might think of it in both different ways. All right, so first looking at the idea that sports fans are lazy, the authors of the piece looked at athletic participation and then success and achievement elsewhere. So the idea being that if sports fans are in fact lazy, they would have less athletic participation than perhaps either before they became fans, or less athletic participation compared to sort of other non-fans out there in the world. And then the success achievement is looking at if they are in fact lazy, they are likely to be less successful and achieve less elsewhere. But both of these kind of get shot down by the reading. First and foremost, it's absurd to think of fans or expect fans to have to participate as well. Just like if there was a fan of theatrical performances, you wouldn't expect them to have to act as well. If they just like plays, they can just go to it, and no one expects them to actually perform in any roles. Or if people enjoy going to concerts and seeing orchestras, perhaps, you wouldn't expect them to also play in the orchestra. It's enough just to be a fan. But despite the absurdity of the expectation, the data shows that sports fans are sort of normal in the amount of athletic participation in like rec leagues or in any sort of intramurals or adult leagues. They have sort of normal levels of athletic participation compared to the rest of society. And in terms of success and achievement elsewhere, sports fans were shown to have better college performance and be more engaged with the community. In a way, this makes sense if you are a really big Butler Bulldogs basketball fan. You would tend to, I would imagine, be more engaged with other Butler Bulldogs basketball fans around campus, obviously at the events themselves. So it makes sense that they're more engaged in the community. But it is interesting to note that the higher graduation rates and better college performance. And if you go beyond sort of sports fans and actual athletes themselves, the graduation rates are also quite high. Alrighty, on to the second item, the aggression element. So the authors of this piece, I thought, did a nice job of laying it out in terms of state aggression versus trait aggression. So state aggression would be those situational, environmental, in the specific context, do sports make people violent? And in the trait side are sports fans normal? Or is there something different about them compared to non-fans? In terms of the trait aggression, sports fans across the board are considered sort of normal. Obviously, there are aggressive people that are sports fans, and there are aggressive people that are not sports fans, but they have sort of the same proportions in both sports fans and non-sports fans of that trait aggression. In terms of state aggression, yes, it is there sometimes. There's no denying that events of the past have shown that sometimes fans sort of boil up enough into aggression, whether it's aggression within the arena or riots and things like that outside of the arena after the fact. This does support the use of value-added theory that we had in previous lectures that focus on sort of what are the ingredients that go into an aggression-packed sort of environment or a really aggressive scene like Malice at the Palace that we've discussed in the past. What are the key elements that are necessary for that to take place? And then one last thing, perhaps not everyone shows aggression, but those who are perhaps predisposed to aggression are sort of heightened by this state aggression. So not all fans are aggressive, but those that maybe do have that trait aggression are worsened or deepened even more so by state aggression. And then third, we have the critique of sports fans that they have negative values or maladaptive behaviors. And this comes from sort of their win at all costs mentality, authoritarianism, and sort of no matter what the coach says or what the owner says, you have to do it. And then sort of built in with that implicit accepting of racism, sexism, corruption, violence, cheating, all of that sort of being okay. It kind of goes back to that first element of win at all costs. So if our star quarterback was allegedly sexually assaulting or doing other sorts of terrible, violent acts over the off season, as long as he comes back and wins at the start of the season, we're okay with whatever violence or sexual acts that he did in the off season. And then lastly, it's important to note throughout this entire reading the difference between anecdote and sort of true scientific generalizable data that we can draw larger conclusions from. So anecdotes are easy to point out every now and then, or point to for almost any of these examples of like, this happened, and I know there was fans that had this type of mentality, or I know these fans were aggressive. And if it's sort of just these one or two or three or even a dozen or so stories that we can think of, those are anecdotes. When we're starting to look at generalizable data, we get into larger issues with sampling and getting a lot more sort of data points to make larger generalizations from. And when we do that in sort of scientific research or social scientific research, especially with regard to sports fans, the results that are shown in this piece anyway were sort of inconclusive. Like maybe there's something tied to alcohol and fandom when we're looking at maladaptive behaviors, but not all fans are okay with racism, sexism, corruption, violence, and cheating or doing the win at all costs types of mentalities. So there might be some examples that we can point to, but most fans aren't sort of on board with that. Even if they cheer for their team and their team maybe has some people that have some sketchy events in their past, it's not as if those fans themselves are cheering for those maladaptive behaviors. So perhaps not everyone it falls under this category as well, just like the previous category of aggression. Perhaps it's not everyone that has these negative values and maladaptive behaviors, but perhaps those that are predisposed to these sort of negative forces are exacerbated by sports fans, or sports fandom, rather. And continuing that line of thought in terms of anecdotes, we come to the poor interpersonal relationships. So this is perhaps one that we see a lot in the media on sort of primetime family comedy types of shows where the bumbling husband is a big sports nut but is terrible at interpersonal relationships, and so much to the point where sports actually is kind of a point of conflict between the husband and wife. And certainly, again, there are anecdotes that we might think of that sort of this fits, this poor interpersonal relationships. But when we start looking at a larger sample size, sort of randomly sampled from fan bases, we don't find that there's that type of correlation between poor interpersonal relationships and sports fandom. If anything, it could be that maybe sports is a uniting factor, but again, it's sort of inconclusive. One thing to keep in mind with this, though, is the idea of social desirability, which in terms of social science research, so if you're asking somebody a question that might be embarrassing or might not paint them in the best light, they're more likely to give a socially desirable answer. So this is in studies that you're asking about how's your relationship with your wife? Is it negatively impacted by sports and by your fandom? Most people are more likely to sort of lie a bit and say, yeah, everything's fine. There's never ever been a problem. And perhaps maybe there was. So it's difficult to get at this in terms of social science research, but we should be careful not to fall victim to anecdotes that make us draw conclusions for the larger population based on the stories of a dozen or so people. So sort of the big takeaways out of this, sports fan identity can be a buffer for the rest of your life if you're having sort of, in terms of your identity, if you're having sort of low moments in maybe your professional career or personal relationships, whatever, family relationships, wherever you're getting your identity sort of boosts from, sports fan identity is shown that it can be a buffer for that and give you a little elevation in your identity or your ego or self-esteem for at least a short period while your team is successful. And that boost can be given even more sort of emphasis or extra oomph if it is a geographically close team where that success is shared by a lot of your peers in the region. It can add to sort of this sort of social bond with you and colleagues or you and classmates, other people in the community. You can have this sort of shared boost to the kind of the community morale. All sorts of mental games that we play in terms of this, in terms of our psychological health and the sports teams we watch. So toward the end of the piece, they talked about burging, coughing, corfing, and blasting. An interesting sort of set of games that we play of whether we sort of revel and roll around in the success or in the victory for a while, or if we start mentally preparing ourselves for when a loss is inevitably going to happen. So this might be as a team advances through March Madness at the end of the college basketball season. Approaches that you can have. You can roll around and making it to the Sweet 16, or you can start preparing yourself mentally for the fact that they're probably not going to win the championship and a loss is going to happen at some point. On the other side, after a loss, you can start looking forward to other things or pick apart why the loss wasn't really that bad, or we can look forward to the draft or look forward to a recruiting class, or we can just sort of vent and blast everything that's wrong with the situation. But all sorts of ways that we can get around sort of feeling bad about ourselves or kind of preserving our future selves if we see it's kind of a bad situation now or a bad situation in terms of our sports team is sort of coming down the road. And that's all we have for this lecture. Feel free to move on to lecture number 4 for the week.